No one knew where the mirror came from or how it ended up in the forgotten antique shop at the edge of Old Castle Alley. Rumors whispered that it had been there for decades, hidden behind a thick black curtain, as if the owners had tried to bury it rather than display it. One cold evening, Salim, a curious young man with a passion for rare artifacts, stumbled upon the shop. The bell above the dusty door let out a weak chime as he entered, and the smell of mold and aged wood hit him like a wall. "Looking for anything unusual?" croaked the old shopkeeper from behind the counter, his eyes sunken and yellowed. Salim nodded, brushing dust off an old lamp. "Something unique." Without a word, the shopkeeper shuffled to the back and pulled aside the black curtain. There it stood, tall, narrow, and framed in tarnished gold. The glass was pristine, too clean for a mirror untouched by time. Salim felt a strange pull toward it. Not curiosity, but something deeper, something hungry. "How much?" he asked. The old man didn't blink. "You can take it. Just don't look into it in the dark." Salim laughed it off, assuming it was just another antique shop gimmick. He loaded the mirror into his car and took it home that same night. The first time it happened, Salim thought it was a trick of the light. He had walked past the mirror in the hallway and noticed his face didn't move. His reflection just stood there, frozen, staring back at him with a grin that didn't match his own. When he turned around, there was no one behind him. The second time, he saw something else in the reflection. Another face just behind his shoulder. Pale, hollow-eyed, grinning wider. From then on, it got worse. Every time he passed by the mirror, his reflection became more detached. It started blinking out of sync, smiling without him. Once he watched in horror as his reflection pressed its hand against the inside of the glass, as if trying to get out or pull something in. One night, he covered the mirror with a blanket. He could still feel it, watching. He started having dreams, if they were dreams at all, where he stood before the mirror, unable to move, while shadowy figures crawled across the surface like oil, whispering in a language that sounded older than the world. Then people started to disappear. His friend Malik, who joked and looked into the mirror one evening, gone. His cousin Layla, who tried to record it with her phone, vanished. The mirror showed nothing afterward, just an empty room, except for their faint reflections still lingering deep in the glass. Now, Salim stays awake at night, afraid to close his eyes. The mirror stands uncovered in his room because covering it doesn't help anymore. He stopped seeing his full reflection. Bit by bit, his face fades from it. His eyes were the first to vanish. He knows the rest will follow. And yet, every night he finds himself standing in front of it, unable to move, watching something that looks like him begin to smile. No one knew where the mirror came from or how it ended up in the forgotten antique shop at the edge of Old Castle Alley. Rumors whispered that it had been there for decades, hidden behind a thick black curtain, as if the owners had tried to bury it rather than display it. One cold evening, Salim, a curious young man with a passion for rare artifacts, stumbled upon the shop. The bell above the dusty door let out a weak chime as he entered, and the smell of mold and aged wood hit him like a wall. "Looking for anything unusual?" croaked the old shopkeeper from behind the counter, his eyes sunken and yellowed. Salim nodded, brushing dust off an old lamp. "Something unique." Without a word, the shopkeeper shuffled to the back and pulled aside the black curtain. There it stood, tall, narrow, and framed in tarnished gold. The glass was pristine, too clean for a mirror untouched by time. Salim felt a strange pull toward it. Not curiosity, but something deeper, something hungry. "How much?" he asked. The old man didn't blink. "You can take it. Just don't look into it in the dark." Salim laughed it off, assuming it was just another antique shop gimmick. He loaded the mirror into his car and took it home that same night. The first time it happened, Salim thought it was a trick of the light. He had walked past the mirror in the hallway and noticed his face didn't move. His reflection just stood there, frozen, staring back at him with a grin that didn't match his own. When he turned around, there was no one behind him. The second time, he saw something else in the reflection. Another face just behind his shoulder. Pale, hollow-eyed, grinning wider. From then on, it got worse. Every time he passed by the mirror, his reflection became more detached. It started blinking out of sync, smiling without him. Once he watched in horror as his reflection pressed its hand against the inside of the glass, as if trying to get out or pull something in. One night, he covered the mirror with a blanket. He could still feel it, watching. He started having dreams, if they were dreams at all, where he stood before the mirror, unable to move, while shadowy figures crawled across the surface like oil, whispering in a language that sounded older than the world. Then people started to disappear. His friend Malik, who joked and looked into the mirror one evening, gone. His cousin Layla, who tried to record it with her phone, vanished. The mirror showed nothing afterward, just an empty room, except for their faint reflections still lingering deep in the glass. Now, Salim stays awake at night, afraid to close his eyes. The mirror stands uncovered in his room because covering it doesn't help anymore. He stopped seeing his full reflection. Bit by bit, his face fades from it. His eyes were the first to vanish. He knows the rest will follow. And yet, every night he finds himself standing in front of it, unable to move, watching something that looks like him begin to smile. Salim stopped trusting his reflection. Every mirror, every window, even the dark screen of his TV, showed something that looked like him, but wasn't. It smiled too easily, blinked too slowly. Sometimes it would move a split second too late, as if struggling to keep up with his reality. He started avoiding his own face. He covered every reflective surface in the apartment: sheets, towels, cardboard, even smeared some with black paint. But no matter what he did, the original mirror always found its way back into the center of his living space, uncovered, like it wanted to be seen. Worse, the mirror no longer needed light to show reflections. In the pitch dark, he would wake up and see a soft glow pulsing from the hallway. A glow that came from within the mirror itself. Shapes moved in it, slow, crawling shadows. And at the center of them, his own image, silently screaming, mouth open, but no sound coming out. Then came the scratching. At first, faint, like nails against glass, then louder, closer, until it wasn't just from the mirror anymore. It was from inside the walls, behind the doors, beneath his bed. Each night, the scratches formed patterns on the walls, spirals, eyes, strange runes that shimmered only in moonlight. He tried photographing them, but the photos showed nothing, just blackness. Then his phone rang. No number. He hesitated and answered. Nothing but a deep breath on the other end. Then a voice, his own voice, whispering, "You're almost hollow now, almost ready to come through." Salim decided to burn it. He soaked the mirror in gasoline, struck a match, and watched the flames lick at the frame. The glass shimmered, twisted, but did not melt. Instead, the fire began to reflect something inside the mirror. Not his apartment, not him. but a vast, endless hallway filled with mirrors stretching infinitely in every direction, and in each one, a different version of him, trapped, silent, rotting. He screamed and turned away, but something had changed. Now his shadow didn't follow him. It stood still, frozen before the mirror. And as he turned back, he saw it, his own shadow, pressed flat against the glass, as if it had been pulled from his feet and locked inside. And the reflection? It stepped forward, smiled, and began to move toward him from inside the mirror. He ran. Not away, there was nowhere to go. He ran to the only place left, the old antique shop. But when he reached the alley, the shop wasn't there. Just an empty lot. No building, no door, no sign it had ever existed. Only a single object left in the middle of the space. The mirror. Standing. Waiting. Salim stood frozen in the empty lot. The cold air bit through his clothes, yet sweat ran down his spine. The mirror stood tall, untouched by wind or dust, gleaming under the sickly glow of the streetlight. Its surface shimmered, not like glass, but like water. Black water, deep, endless, pulling at the soul. He should have run, but something in him had already surrendered. His feet moved forward on their own, step by step. And with every step, the world around him grew quieter. The hum of the street lights faded. The distant city noise vanished. Even the sound of his own breathing disappeared. Only one sound remained. Tap, 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 from the other side of the mirror. When he stood before it again, he didn't see himself. Instead, he saw the hallway, the one from the fire vision, clearer now. Endless mirrors stretched along dark marble floors. The ceiling was so high it faded into blackness. And there, in the distance, one of the reflections began walking toward him. Not running, not threatening, just calmly, silently, with its head tilted and no eyes. Salim stepped back, heart racing, but his reflection did not move. It kept walking forward from within the mirror. And then the frame cracked. Not the glass. The frame itself split at the corners, like something inside was pushing out. The ornate gold peeled back, as if it had grown too tight around the thing emerging. The surface of the mirror rippled. And then, like thick smoke, a hand emerged, pale, long-fingered, cold as death. It didn't grab him. It reached up and wiped the mirror from inside. And now, he saw it all. Dozens of other people, faces twisted in terror, frozen inside the glass. Some of them he knew, others strangers, all staring at him as if begging him not to do what they had done, as if pleading for him to stop before he joined them. But it was too late. His feet were no longer touching the ground. The mirror was pulling him. And then, for a single fleeting moment, he saw something behind the reflections. A throne, a being, eyes like burning glass, teeth that never stopped grinning, and behind it, thousands of mirrors, stacked like bones. It whispered in 1,000 voices layered as one. There is no escape, only reflection. You are not watching the mirror is watching you. When Salim awoke, he was lying in his bed. The room was clean. The mirror was gone. Everything seemed normal. He laughed in relief, but then he noticed something strange. The mirror above the sink. His reflection didn't move. It just stared and slowly raised a hand to wave goodbye. Salim didn't tell anyone. Who would believe him? That a mirror had tried to consume him? That he had seen another world beyond glass, ruled by a smiling god of reflections? No, he said nothing. He pretended. He worked. He smiled. He avoided mirrors. But mirrors didn't avoid him. It started subtly. Reflections lingered just a second too long after he walked away. Windows became darker at night, as if shadows were gathering on the other side. Sometimes, when passing by a car window, he would catch a glimpse of his reflection smiling, even though he wasn't. One night, his bathroom light flickered, and when he looked at the mirror, he saw his own face with something off. The pupils weren't centered. His reflection's head tilted. His didn't. Then the mirror blinked, but he hadn't. That night, he smashed every mirror in the house, but the moment the last shard hit the floor, he heard it again. Tap, 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 not from glass, from inside his head. He started dreaming again. Not of the hallway, not anymore. Now it was a room of infinite darkness with only one mirror in the center. Floating, silent, waiting, and around it, dozens of Salims, each one trapped in glass, some whispering, some screaming, some smiling. And one of them, one that looked just like him, simply said, "You got out. We didn't. He's not done with you yet." Then he'd wake up, heart racing, only to see his reflection still sleeping in the mirror, not moving, not waking. By now, Salim no longer trusted his own senses. One day, he was washing his face. When he looked up, he saw not himself, but Layla, the cousin who vanished. Her eyes were bleeding, her mouth was stitched shut. She raised a hand and scratched a word into the foggy mirror. Run! But where could he run? Every screen, every glass surface, every polished metal object began to reflect not the real world, but the mirrored world. People he passed in the street no longer cast reflections, but he did. Dozens of them, all different, all wrong. And sometimes, when he looked closely enough, he could see his real self trapped, banging on the other side, screaming silently. Then came the worst moment. He stood before the broken bathroom mirror, shards everywhere, and behind him, in every shard, a different version of himself. Some smiling, some bleeding, some missing faces. And one of them whispered, not from his mouth, but directly into his mind, "You're not Salim. You're the one who got out, and he took your place. Now, Salim doesn't know who he is anymore. He sees too many versions of himself, and not one of them feels real. Sometimes he stares at his hands and wonders if they're really his. And the mirror? It's back. It always comes back. Tonight it stands in his hallway again, clean, cold, humming softly with voices he almost understands. And his reflection? It's standing still, but slowly, its eyes begin to glow. It was no longer a question of if. Salim knew. He was no longer outside the mirror. Or perhaps he never had been. He sat in his apartment, cold and hollow, staring at the mirror at the end of the hallway. It had stopped hiding. It wanted to be seen now. It wanted him to look. And he did. Slowly, carefully, he stood, walked toward it. No fear left, only a numb understanding. The reflection waiting for him was not himself. It was the original Salim, the real one, the one who never escaped. His eyes were gone, hollow pits of black, his mouth stitched shut like Layla's, his skin pale and glassy. Behind him, that world of endless mirrors shimmered, all of them filled with trapped souls, all of them still, all watching him. And then the reflection moved, not in sync, not delayed. It moved on its own. It stepped forward and placed its hand on the inside of the glass. Salim reached out, and for the first time, their palms touched. The glass felt warm. alive. The mirror began to soften like liquid glass. His hand sank through, then his arm, then his whole body. No resistance, no pain, just a cold pulling and a whisper in 1,000 voices. Welcome home. On the other side, everything was quiet. No sound, no time, just mirrors. Salim turned to look, and there he was, standing in the hallway of his apartment again. But he wasn't inside, he was looking through. The version of him now walking around, laughing, eating, talking on the phone, wasn't him. It was something else. Something wearing his skin, something that didn't cast a reflection. And then Salim finally understood. The mirror didn't devour faces. It devoured identity. It swapped souls, traded freedom for imitation, and left you watching your own life, lived by something else. Somewhere in a dim-lit antique shop that never stays in one place for long, the mirror stands waiting, framed in gold, polished clean, empty. For now. Because the next person who looks too long, the next who stays too close when it's dark, the next who smiles at their own reflection and sees it smile wider. They'll be next. And you? You just looked into the glass, didn't you? The end.